What is up, y'all? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt, and this week I am going to be talking about Merfolk. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Gravelgill Scoundrel. This is a common in Lore When Eclipsed. It is a 1 and a blue 1/3 Merfolk rogue. It's got vigilance, and whenever this creature attacks, you may tap another untapped creature you control. If you do, this creature can't be blocked this turn. I am going to split this episode kind of into two halves. The first half is going to be an in-depth, probably too in-depth look at the history of 2-mana 1/3s in Contemporary Limited. The other half of this episode is going to be talking more specifically about Gravelgill Scoundrel and the Merfolk in this set in general. So let's start and dive into 2-mana 1/3s. And just want to say, I kind of hate 2-mana 1/3s in Limited. You can go search on Scryfall, like what were the 2-mana 1/3s we've had in recent limited sets. And I'm just going to tell you, spoiler alert, most of them are pretty bad. There are some notable exceptions. 2-mana 1/3s, there have been some good ones. There have been some formats, or maybe one format in particular that I'll talk about, where 2-mana 1/3 was a good stat line. But generally, 2-mana 1/3 is probably the worst stat line out of 2-mana 3/1, 2/2, or 1/3. And I haven't really been able to figure out why this is until this set. I think I came across a way of explaining it that makes sense to me why this is why this is the worst performing stat line of all the 2-mana creatures. On the surface, it is tempting to describe a 2-mana 1/3 as a good blocker with a defensive stat line. And that is because, it has higher toughness than power. So it's going to be able to block something like a 2/2, and those creatures are going to bounce off each other. I will say for a 1/3 stat line, it does hold off 1/1s and 2/1s. It means that it can brick wall those can't attack, but it doesn't actually brick wall 2/2s, 3/2s, going up the curve like that. If the creature attacking has higher toughness, it doesn't actually dissuade them for attacking. And that's actually really relevant to defensive speed, to your game plan if you're trying to get to the long game. A 2-mana 1/3 almost never will trade up on mana. You would have to have like a 3-mana 4/1 or something, which is a stat line we've gotten. But if you have a 2-mana 2/2, that has the ability to trade with your opponent's 3-mana 3/2. Maybe they have like the Elf Lord. Basically, if your opponent is playing a bunch of 2/2s, it doesn't actually dissuade your opponent from attacking like a 2-mana 3/1. So if the opponent has like a very valuable 2/2 or 3/2 on the board, this creature doesn't actually prevent their attacks, because if you have a 2-mana 3/1, that creature actually dissuades your opponent from attacking with their valuable creature that has a stat line that would trade with it. Oh, 2-mana 1/3 doesn't actually do that. And in this format in particular, there are a bunch of creatures that either pump themselves or the team. I'm talking mostly about the creature lords, like the Merfolk Lord or the Elf Lord or the Kithkin kind of lord that pumps the team when other creatures enter. The 2-mana 1/3 is actually really bad against those, because even if they are playing tokens, like in Kithkin has so many ways to actually pump those tokens up and make the 1/3 not be able to block profitably. And like I said, if you're in a defensive deck, you would often rather have creatures that can actually trade up on mana, because a lot of times when you're defensive, you don't want your opponent to be able to assemble their synergies. And assembling synergies requires multiple pieces on the board, and you would rather have something like a Lys Alana Informant, which in this set is a 2-mana 3/1 in green. It's an Elf Scout. When it enters or dies, surveil 1. This is a card that actually threatens to trade with your opponent's synergy pieces and take those impactful creatures off the board. And Lys Alana Informant is actually particularly good in this set. It's not like an amazing creature or anything, but for the elf deck, this creature is an elf when it's on the battlefield, and elves also almost always care about elves in the graveyard as well. So this is a synergy piece. It's an elf that helps your cards that care about elves when it's on the battlefield and in the graveyard, and has a stat line that actually trades off. Very similarly, this is like the functional reprint of Wary Watchdog from Duskmourn, just the same exact ability and stats, different type line, of course. But Wary Watchdog was really useful for the Delirium decks because this is a defensive speed creature that threatened to trade and put potentially multiple pieces of types in your graveyard for Delirium, while being just a generally good stat line in the format. And what really clarified my thoughts on 2-mana 3/1s, what got me to the point where I felt like I could confidently talk about what's going on with the stat line just in Limited in general, was looking back at which 2-mana 1/3s performed well in older Limited formats. And it was actually really hard to find good 2-mana 1/3s compared to just like 2-mana 2/2s or 2-mana 3/1s. And the gist of it, kind of what I'm talking about with the stat lines, is there's a question of, do you want this piece of material on the battlefield? Do you want this piece of material to stick around on the battlefield? Or would you rather it trade off with your opponent's resources and go to the graveyard? There's something with big game, small game here. Like if you want a big game, you want pieces of material sticking around on the battlefield. If you want a small game, you want your pieces to trade off with your opponents. But this really clarifies to me why I hate the card Summit Sentinel in this format. This is a common. It's 1 in a blue, 1/3. It's a creature elemental soldier, and when this creature dies, you draw a card. A 2-mana 1/3 is bad at trading. It's not good at trading. It's good at bouncing off creatures, but it is not a good card to trade with your opponent's resources. And Summit Sentinel is just a 1/3 body until it dies. And the thing that 1/3s are the worst at is actually trading off and dying. And also further, the elemental type line of this creature is the least relevant out of all of the supported creature types. Like elementals care about having elementals to cast, because it can use mana to cast that with Flame Braider. It matters for some stuff, but compared to the other creature types, elemental is kind of the least supported, and you care the least about an elemental sitting on the battlefield. You want a Summit Sentinel to trade off, and it's actually pretty hard for it to trade off profitably. 1/3s are good at sticking around. They're good at teaming up on double blocks. But if you're double blocking with Summit Sentinel, your opponent can just choose to kill the other creature. I hate this card. I think I played it in my deck when I am in an elementals deck and I need like I have a bunch of convoke spells and I need 2-drops. But so often my opponent plays a Summit Sentinel and that on turn 2, and that creature is still sticking around on the battlefield on turn 8. They have not profitably traded this off and got the card like they think they're going to. So it was hard for me to find examples of good defensive 1/3s. The one card that I found that's slam dunk for this is Zookeeper Mechan. This was from Edge of Eternities. It's a 2-mana 1/3 artifact creature. It taps to add red and then has this expensive 7-mana ability to pump one of your creatures. This card is a perfect example of a 2-mana 1/3 that you wanted to stick around on the battlefield. First of all, it's a mana dork. You can use it for mana to accelerate. You can use the mana in the late game. It has this activated ability on itself. So if the Zookeeper Mechan is on the battlefield, sort of bumping off blocks with your opponent, and then in the late game, this is still on the battlefield, you get to activate that ability when it's useful. That's a really good use case for a 2-mana 1/3. It's also an artifact. Artifact type mattered in that format. Just having your typed creature stick around on the battlefield for a while is useful. What I found when I was looking at these 2-mana 1/3s was the ones with offensive utility were actually more useful and performed better usually than the defensive ability 2-mana 1/3s. So I'm going to go like a little into like cube constructed, but the perfect example of this to me is Dreadhorde Arcanist, which is one of my favorite cards of all time. Could be my favorite card of all time. This is a 2-mana 1/3. It's a rare. It was from War of the Spark. It's actually banned in Legacy. It's got trample, and when it attacks, you get to cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard with mana value less than its power for free. So this is a card that you want sticking on the battlefield because it accrues value turn after turn. And a 2-mana 1/3 on attacks is actually, if you want the creature to not trade off, is actually a really good stat line and better than 2-mana 3/1, 2-mana 2/2, because often your opponent is going to have to double block this early in the game. Like if you go 2-mana 1/3, they go 2-mana 2/2, and then you just attack for free. that gives you free attacks without your opponent being able to profitably block early, and then sometimes they have to like double block this in the mid game. The common theme for these 2-mana 1/3s is creatures that sort of not like accrue value, but have utility in attacks turn after turn. Another great example, moving like down in rarity, was Arabella Abandoned Doll in Duskmourn. This was one of the Boros signposts. It's a 2-mana 1/3 in Boros. When it attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. So this card wouldn't actually threaten to like trade with your opponent's creatures. You can just kind of in the early game send it in for free and you get that drain. And then once it gets brickwalled, it would just kind of like sit on the battlefield and you could sort of nickel and dime your opponent. And then in the mid game, because you have these pieces sticking around on the battlefield, you would be able to say like swing it in for a 5-point life swing. Maybe if you had a wide board and you were attacking all, they would have to sort of like put 2 blockers in front of it to profitably block it. There was a card that could give it unblockable. And you would be able to like get in with 2 swings with that in the late game. This is like another perfect card for the 2-mana 1/3 stat line, where if this was a 3/1, your opponent would be more easily able to trade with it, and it would like lose that ability of sticking around and being a threat later, while also having dealt some damage in the early game. Shock Brigade was another one. This one was from Tarkir. This is a 2-mana 1/3 menace with Mobilize 1, which just basically when it attacks, you also get a temporary attacking token. Menace on this means it has to be double blocked. This is 2 points of damage. That's kind of like your opponent doesn't really want to block it. And in a go wide deck, this was very, very utile there as well. And I can't mention 2-mana 1/3s without talking about Sahagin, which is another offensive creature. This was a 2-mana 1/3. You would play it. It would sort of bounce off your opponent's creatures in the early game, maybe get an attack in. And then as the game was progressing, it scaled up and became a really potent, unblockable source of damage in your blue like mid-range decks. And maybe the best format of all time for 1/3 stat line was Lord of the Rings. Specifically the card Pelargir Survivor, which was like a 2-mana 1/3 mana dork in blue for instants and sorceries. I'm not going to read what the tempt ring mechanic does, but basically like it was really good to have a 1/3 creature for the rain tempts you, because that meant that it was hard. Low power meant it was really hard to block. The like pseudo death touch ability meant that with a 1/3, if they had to double block it to actually kill it, it was pretty hard. That was a very favorable exchange for you with the ring tempts you. So Lord of the Rings was also another set where 2-mana 1/3s really thrived, and it was really important for your ring bearer to stick around on the battlefield. So that was sort of the outlier. And one of the reasons that I love the ring tempts you was just because it led to so many like unique situations and in deck building and card evaluation. Was a really, really interesting format. Moving on, scoping back down into this format, there's a couple 2-mana 1/3s that I like. Obviously, Gravelgill Scoundrel, the namesake of the episode. This is a 2-mana 1/3 that I do like. It's way better than Summit Sentinel. I despise Summit Sentinel. Gristle Glutton. Gristle Glutton is a 2-mana 1/3 creature Goblin Scout. You can tap it to Blight 1, discard a card if you do draw a card. This is a card with a type. A 2-mana 1/3 is good at sticking around. The type matters in the mid-late game. Gristle Glutton has this persistent activated ability. It doesn't pressure very well, but the Goblin deck doesn't really play a very quick, aggressive game. It's more of an attrition game. I think a lot of the red decks in this format are like that. Gristle Glutton fits right in this format as something to do with your mana early that can kind of bump off creatures in the early game and has this persistent activated ability that's useful in the late game as well. A card that I was really low on initially, and people were trying to talk me up and I didn't see it, but I actually cast it this week, is Foraging Wickermaw. This is a colorless common. It's 2-mana 1/3. When it enters, Surveil 1, and then you can pay 1 mana to add 1 mana of any color, and then this creature becomes that color until end of turn. You can only activate this once a turn. Foraging Wickermaw is a card that people were trying to talk me up on early, and I did not buy it because, like I said, I know that 2 mana 1/3 is not a good defensive stat line for trading your creatures. It does not fare well into the lords in this format. However, the important part of this card for decks that care about its fixing and its color changing ability is that this card is a thing that sticks around on the battlefield for your vivid decks. So like I said, a 2 mana 1/3 is bad at trading off, so this is going to stay on the battlefield throughout most of the game. And then in the late game, when you finally get to your vivid payoffs, this is extremely useful as just being +1 to vivid. It's mana fixing as well. I do really, really like this card when you are playing in the vivid space, when you care about vivid in some respect in your deck. And that was something that was not clear to me until I realized the point of 2 mana 1/3s is that they're not trading and sticking around as resources on the battlefield. So let's focus back in on Gravelgill Scoundrel. So this is very Sahagin-ish. Sahagin was also a Merfolk. It also has an unblockable ability. So it like holds the ground later and then can peck in persistently for points of damage. The reason that I particularly like this card, especially in Merfolk decks, almost exclusively in Merfolk decks, is that it is a free enabler for your tap synergies in the mid to late game. And that is really benefited by the fact that a 2 mana 1/3 is going to stick around. And also it has a type, so you can play this on curve, you can sort of get your tap synergies on curve, and then when you find your lord, it becomes an even more persistent, annoying threat when it's actually pumped and pressures the opponent a little bit better. So that's a really good transition from talking about this stat line in general to specifically in this format talking about the Merfolk archetype. And, you know, this format is way more about cards than decks. I think that Limited Level Ups did a really good job explaining this. If you are talking about building a blue-white deck, it's way more about which cards are actually in your deck. Are you like a blue deck mainly? Are you a white deck mainly? Which rares do you have? How much Merfolk synergy is there? I'm not going to be able to give you a recipe for this is how you build Merfolk, because it really matters sort of what actual cards are in your deck. I've had Merfolk decks, I've had blue-white decks that like really care about the Merfolk type. I had a deck the other day with a couple really good blue-white rares, and then I had a couple deep channel duelists with like 3 other Merfolk, and it was basically just grizzly bears, which is like fine, but there's a very wide spectrum for every deck in how much you care about the type in this format. So I'm not going to give you, here's how you build blue-white Merfolk, but I am going to give you a lot of information about the actual cards that might go into your blue-white deck and what that means for the deck itself. I will start with the Merfolk tap synergies, specifically the card Tributary Vaulter, which is the Wombo combo with Gravelgill Scoundrel. This is a common. It's a 3 mana 1/3 in white, has flying, and whenever this creature becomes tapped, another target Merfolk you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. I'm sure you've seen this already, but this is a very good combo at common to push a lot of damage. It's sort of a plan in and of itself at common with Gravelgill Scoundrel. You attack with Gravelgill Scoundrel, even like on turn 3 when you just play the Tributary Vaulter, tap the Vaulter to Scoundrel, and then your Scoundrel is a 3/3 unblockable. Boom, that's Otter Penguin. We're really doing it. I find that this is a combo that you can put together at common that is something that is worth doing if you need pressure. Tributary Vaulter is not a very good like mid-range card if you feel like you're going to be in situations where you need to be like trading off resources with your opponent. This is not a good card at doing that, but if you're in a deck that wants to push some damage, maybe you have a couple of the deep channel duelists, the Merfolk Lord, this is a combo that you can get at common that is very consistently good at doing that, pushing damage evasively in fact. And Gravelgill Scoundrel also turns up all of the cards that say when this creature becomes tapped on curve, which has been really useful to me to push my deck into something that's doing something proactive and something strong. Because a lot of times in this format, when you don't see like good rares, you need to find something like that to push your deck over the edge. So we can just walk through some of the tap synergies. There's Wanderbrine Preacher, which is a 2-mana 2/2 in white at common. Whenever this creature becomes tapped, you gain 2 life. This card's performing a lot worse than I would have expected coming off Compassionate Healer in Avatar. It's still really strong. This is a good mid-range card. It trades well. It can get a bunch of life in the mid-game. If you have other tap synergies, like we'll talk about later, like with Convoke, it gets you a lot of life, which can really be good against stuff like Goblins or Kithkin that's pressuring you. Silvergill Peddler is a 3-mana 2/3 at common in blue. Whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, discard a card. I don't like this card. It's playable if you're in the Merfolk deck with a bunch of Scoundrels. Having that persistent source of card selection is nice. Not a card I love, a card that I have played before. Very similarly, Wanderwine Distractor is a 4-mana 4/3. Whenever this creature becomes tapped, target creature an opponent controls gets -3/-0 until end of turn. Again, a card that I will play when I have these tap synergies, but not one that I'm like super excited about. The uncommons are pretty good. There's Encumbered Regeray, which is a 2-mana 5/4, but enters with 3 -1/-1 counters on it. When it becomes tapped, you remove a counter on it. This card's very nice. I think just a totally fine playable 2-drop. Pretty good, in fact, and gets even better if you can tap it to the Gravelgill Scoundrel on curve. Another similar card is Pestered Wellguard, which is a 4-mana 3/2. When it becomes tapped, create a 1/1 blue and black fairy token creature with flying. Another one that's pretty like okay. Like this is a kind of awkward card because you have to get in combat to use the ability. But if you can sidestep that with Gravelgill Scoundrel, especially on curve, Scoundrel's really good at doing all of these things on curve, which is important. I think this card moves up from kind of mediocre to like pretty good if you're putting these synergies together. A card that I want to rant about a little bit is Meander's Guide, which is another card in the tap space. This is a 3-mana 3/2 uncommon in white. When it attacks, you may tap another untapped Merfolk you control. When you do, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is completely, I'm going to like rant for a second. This is completely different than Gravelgill Scoundrel and the other like when this creature becomes tapped cards, because this is not when it becomes tapped. It's when it attacks specifically, and you have to tap another untapped Merfolk, which is also different than Gravelgill Scoundrel, which can tap any creature. I just really don't like this inconsistency. However, I think this card's fine in Merfolk. Find it pretty good. If you have a bunch of the duelists, getting that back in combat and making this a 4/3 and even harder to block is still a pretty good card. And this is a card that I've played when I'm playing in the Merfolk tap space. A couple other enablers I like. Wanderbrine Trapper. This is the 1-mana 2/1 Merfolk at uncommon in white. You can pay 1 and tap it. Tap another untapped creature you control to tap target creature an opponent controls. Never cutting this from a white deck. It's just good and bumps up your tap synergies a little bit. I have not put Springleaf Drum in a deck yet. This is a 1-mana artifact that you can tap it and tap another untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. I played a lot of this card in Brothers War. It gets better the more cheap cards you have, and I'm simply just not putting that many cheap cards in my deck in this format. But this does turn on your tap synergies on curve and can accelerate you if you're playing a lot of creatures. There's definitely a spot for this in Merfolk. I haven't done it yet, but if I'm playing this card, if I'm playing a Springleaf Drum, I want it to replace a land, and I want my deck, I'm probably not interested in playing Drum unless my deck looks like the type of deck where I can cut a land for it. So a lot of cheap creatures, which definitely seems hard to put together in this format, but there is a place for this, especially in Merfolk. The other big enabler, which should be like pretty obvious, is Convoke. Convoke is in this set. That's a very easy way to tap your Merfolk. There's a lot of really good Convoke cards. I won't run through all of them, but like at common, you have Temporal Cleansing and Unexpected Assistance, which are the Tuck spell and the Draw spell respectively. At uncommon, I really want to point out Omni Changeling. This is 3 blue 0/0 Changeling Convoke. You may have it enter as a copy of any creature on the battlefield with Changeling. There's a lot, like I said last week, this format's all about high impact single spells. And this is a second copy of your really high impact creature or a copy of your opponent's really high impact creature as well. I think this card's fantastic. It's been shooting up for me in pick order. I think it's one of in the top half of uncommons in the set, maybe even the top quarter. I think this card's really strong and obviously plays really well in the tap space as well. And then you have a couple other pretty good ones. Protective Response, which is a convoke, destroy attacker and blocking creature. And Wanderwine Farewell, which is the double bounce spell that makes Merfolk if you have Merfolk. These cards are just both really good. I like them quite a bit. Harmonized Crescendo is 4 blue instant convoke at rare. Choose a creature type, draw a card for each permanent you control of that type. I think in general, this is worse than Unexpected Assistance. Just in general, Harmonized Crescendo, I would almost never play in an Elementals deck, but I think if you are in like a dedicated Merfolk deck, I think this card becomes pretty good, and the ceiling is obviously way higher than Unexpected Assistance. I just would in general take it below Assistance, but it does have a spot, especially here. For just building blue-white decks in general, I want to just really stress you want to be mindful of your deck's plan. Are you sort of beating down, chipping in damage with Gravelgill Scoundrel, or are you playing more of like a blue control deck? I think the Merfolk cards can play either way. It's sort of either side of Convoke. So if you are sort of beating down, a couple cards I really like are Aquatex Defenses to protect your threats. This is the 2-mana aura in blue at common. Has flash, enchant creature you control. When it enters, the creature gets hexproof and it gets +1/+2. Also, Wary Farmer is one. Wary Farmer is one Selesnya hybrid for 3/3 Kithkin. At the beginning of your end step, if another creature entered the battlefield under your control this turn, surveil 1. These are sort of good proactive spells. Like Aquatex Defenses is reactive, but it protects your proactive threats. And if you're playing in the sort of go wide convoke creature beatdown space, I actually like Gold Meadow Nomad more in Merfolk than I do in Kithkin. This is a 1-mana 1/2 Kithkin Scout that you can pay 1 white and exile from your graveyard to make a 1/1 white and green Kithkin creature token as a sorcery. I have played this more in Merfolk than I have in Kithkin. I think it's pretty good if you have a lot of Convoke spells. And a good Convoke spell for these creature beatdown decks is Sundappled Celebrant, which is the 6-mana Convoke Vigilance 5/6 at common and white. I've had a couple Merfolk decks that are beating down and want to use Convoke very proactively like this. Another good card with the Sundappled Celebrant is Everstrike's Gift, which is a 1-mana aura that gives a creature +1/+0 and flying, and then you can rebuy it by blighting. I found that to be a pretty good combo for pushing damage in the mid-late game. If you're coming from the blue direction, you want to often use Convoke as a sort of in the elemental space, which cares about casting spells with mana value 4 or greater. So at common, you have the Izzet Hybrid 3-drop, which is a 3/2 elemental sorcerer, Flaring Cinder. When this creature enters and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. This really illustrates this sort of thing is more on the blue side if you're a more blue control mid-range deck. Flaring Cinder is a really nice way to get persistent card advantage out of your Convoke spells. And very similarly at uncommon, Tanufel Rhyme Speaker is a 4-mana 2/4 in blue. Whenever you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, draw a card. Just some good ways to get persistent card advantage out of these Convoke spells. You do want a really low curve. I haven't mentioned, but Gravelgill Scoundrel does have Vigilance, which means you can attack with it, use it in combat, and then also still cast your instant speed Convoke spells. The last point I want to make is a couple more tools to push damage. I've played almost all of these in Merfolk decks, and I think they're mostly pretty good if you need ways to push more damage. Really taking advantage of the unblockability on Gravelgill Scoundrel and the flying on Tributary Vaulter and other just flying creatures in these colors. So first is a couple equipment. One is Bark of Doran. This is a 2-mana white equipment at uncommon. Equipped creature gets +0/+1, and then if its toughness is greater than its power, it deals damage equal to its toughness, and this has equip 1. This is really strong. It's a really strong boost with Gravelgill Scoundrel. Turns Scoundrel into essentially a 4/4. Vigilance unblockable, which pushes a lot of damage. I really like, I haven't done this yet, but I'm very excited to put Bark of Doran in these sort of tempo-ish blue-white Merfolk decks, because a lot of these creatures have really high toughness. Also, Tributary Bolter turns it into a 4/4 that pumps something else when it attacks. In a similar respect, a card I like a lot less is Stalactite Dagger, which is the 2-mana equipment. When it enters, create a 1/1 shapeshifter with Changeling, and then the equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has like the Changeling ability. This card's not very good in this format. This is something you can put on your evasive creatures to pump them up. Does push damage. I find a lot of times if I'm in this deck, I don't really care about the stat lines of my creatures because I'm often convoking with them. So the 1/1 convokes just fine and can wear a buff from your Deep Channel Duelist, the Merfolk Lord. So I have played Stalactite Dagger in these blue-white decks and been pretty happy with it. For larger boosts of damage to end the game, there's 2 cards that can push really big amounts of damage on single creature. One is Thoughtweft Imbuer, which is the 4-mana 0/5 Kithkin Advisor uncommon. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of Kithkin you control. Don't have to be a Kithkin deck to play this. You'll have some changelings, maybe with the dagger, in fact. If you're playing this more convoky deck, you might have the Gold Meadow Nomads that are Kithkin 1-drops. Thoughtweft Imbuer can pump a lot of damage on your evasive threats and is a way to win a game below rare in this format. I've played this in my Merfolk decks. It's been really good. A very similar card, which I think is basically the same card in this deck, but a little worse, is Glister Baron, which is 2 triple Simic hybrid at uncommon for a 1/4 and has Vivid. At the beginning of combat on your turn, another target creature you control gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. If you're playing this in a blue-white deck, this almost always gives +3 until end of turn, which is a huge boost on your evasive threats. I have cast this in Merfolk decks, and it was actually very, very strong. So definitely keep an eye out for Glister Baron as a way to push damage on your evasive threats if you have a deck like this. And that's going to wrap it up. Thanks for listening. I'm really enjoying this format. Actually, I think there's a lot to offer. I'm actually quite sad that Ninja Turtles is coming out so early, because I think that this might be the best format for this podcast format of talking about individual cards and the roles they have in your deck. Maybe I'll do like a double week or something if I have time. Probably not. No promises, but we'll see. I'm really enjoying this format. I hope you are too. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach me on Blue Sky, sampratt.bsky.social, Discord, samp6, and I stream at twitch.tv/samp_mtg. Thanks for listening. See you next week.